Thank you everybody for joining us. Please be patient as we allow everybody to join us through the waiting room. It'll take 5 or 10 seconds to bring everybody in, and then we'll get started. Thank you for joining us. We'll go live in just a second.
Hello, I am Paul Peterson, Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the 6th session in this series on the post-pandemic future of homeschooling. As a reminder, this, like all of our sessions, is being recorded and will soon be available on the program's website, where you now find last week's session. Automatic captioning is available by clicking the bottom at the bottom of the screen. I wish to thank Antonio Wentland, Michael Poor, and Nick Tavares for their assistance with this conference, and I'm especially grateful to Daniel Hamlin, the professor at the University of Oklahoma, who is an expert on this topic, who has played such a key role in organizing the event. Today, we move from research on homeschooling in the United States to a wider look across the world. It's often thought to be unique to the United States, at least to people in this country, but we have noticed during the course of this conference and even before that it has become a topic of conversation worldwide. Many have seen a major increase in homeschooling during the pandemic when schools were closed. Every country has its own regulations, its own reasons for introducing homeschooling into its environment, its own set of parental concerns. We can't explore all the variety out there, but we hope to give a taste of it in the course of the conversation today. So Daniel, would you introduce our researchers?
I sure will. Thank you, Paul. So for our session today, of course, we have 4 international scholars who study homeschooling in their respective countries. So first we have from Israel, we have Ari Newman, who will be giving our first presentation together with his colleague Oz Guterman. Dr. Newman is an associate professor in the Department of Education at the Western Galilee College in Israel. And he's done a vast amount of research on why families choose to homeschool and also how they go about the practice. Dr. Guterman is a senior lecturer and chair of the Department of Human Resources at Western Galilee College. And he also looks at homeschooling, looks at outcomes associated with homeschooling, particularly in Israel, and has done quite a bit of research in this area there. Our next presentation from France, we have Philippe Bongrand. He is an associate professor of education at CY Cergy Paris University. He's the leader of France's National Research Agency on Home Education, and he's currently engaged in a wide range of research projects on homeschooling in France. Then moving north of the border from Canada, we have Christine Brabant. She'll be joining us, and she's an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Montreal. She looks at many different facets of homeschooling in Canada, including unschooling and homeschooling regulation. And then finally, we have our commentator for this session is Albert Cheng. Dr. Cheng is assistant professor at the Department of Education Reform in the College of Education and Health Professions at the University of Arkansas. He's also done research on homeschooling and political tolerance. And he's also recently edited a special issue on homeschooling research that was published in the Peabody Journal of Education. As a very quick note to our audience, you're going to be able to see the panelists, but the members of the audience will not be visible to you. You should feel free to post your questions to the panelists using the Q&A function in Zoom, but we ask that you pose succinct questions that will help us to be able to find the question, pull it out, and pose it to the panelists. And of course, you may also use the chat function in Zoom, but we do request that your commentary remain focused on the content and the substance of the presentations. Okay, so with that, Ari, I'm going to turn it over to you first.
Thank you. Oz, will you share the... You're on mute. Oz, you're on mute.
Okay. Zoom issues. Well, hello everybody. I'm Oz Guterman, and I will be presenting with my dear colleague, Professor Ari Neumann, pedagogical attitudes of homeschool adolescents. And we'll begin a little bit with describing homeschooling in Israel. There are about 1,200 children homeschooled in Israel. It can seem like a small number, but you have to remember that 2 decades ago, we almost didn't have homeschooling at all in Israel. So there is a very steep rise in the number and percentage of homeschooled children in Israel. And you have to understand that Israel is a very, very small country. Okay, you can drive from 2 sides of Israel in 5 hours, I think, about 5 hours. So it's very easy for homeschooled families to meet. There's usually meetings of homeschool family 2 or 3 times a week, regional meetings. And usually families know each other very well. There's a sense of community in the homeschooled family. And of course, in Israel, we have all the variety of types of homeschooling. We have the very structured schooling and the unschooling. We have all types of homeschooling, but we think that in Israel, there is a higher percentage compared to other countries of naturalistic homeschooling. Families that are more close to nature, and usually they choose homeschooling not because of academic reasons, or mainly because of the well-being of the children, and trying to raise them in a more natural way. In Israel, if you want to homeschool, you have to apply to the Ministry of Education. Usually, an inspector, regional inspector of the Ministry of Education will come and visit the family. Of course, for the last year, it used to be, it was a Zoom meeting, but when there's no COVID pandemic, it's meeting at the houses of the families. There's no testing or anything like it. It's usually just to see that there's no mental illness or any kind of abuse of the children or something like this. And in most cases, the application are approved. And for the last 2 decades, we've looked into homeschooling. We've conducted several studies. We looked into parents and children. In a few of the studies, we looked into parents and children together, and examined the influence of homeschooling parents on the children. We looked into adolescents and also studied the inspectors and to understand their perspective of homeschooling. We have combined qualitative and quantitative instruments. We think this is a better way to understand this phenomena. And when we've looked at several issues, as you can see here, we've listed a few of them. We have looked into emotional and behavioral aspects of homeschooling, usually comparing homeschool children to school-going children, but sometimes comparing different types of homeschool children. We looked into adolescents and also at social skill of homeschool children. But now we'll focus on a specific study. And Ari, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So you will be moving forward the slides, yes? Oz?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, so go ahead then. We are going to talk today about research that you've conducted regarding pedagogical attitudes of homeschooled adolescents. And please, Oz, it is important to understand that we don't know much about homeschool adolescents' attitudes, especially towards learning, but in general in Israel. I don't know if there is a lot of data in other countries about adolescents and the way they perceive homeschooling and learning, but we don't have a lot of knowledge about it. And we thought it is important to look at homeschooling through the point of view of these children, because even though it is the parents who make the decision to homeschool, it influences greatly. The children are influenced greatly. So the purpose of the present study is to look at homeschooling, at homeschool children or adolescents or young adults, and the way they perceive learning. And because this is an exploratory research and we don't have a lot of data about it, we wanted to do it in a qualitative method, and we used interviews. We interviewed 19 homeschool children with the average age of 18, more or less, and we asked them 5 open questions. What is learning? What do you learn? When do you learn? How do you learn? And why do you learn? And we thought that if we ask these questions and then evoke a discussion, we might have a look into the way, into a broader picture regarding the perception of these young people about learning. So this is a summary of the findings, but I don't think we have time to go into every answer. So I will elaborate about it a little bit in the next slide. But Oz, can you go back one slide, please, to the table? So what did we actually downsized the answers. We got a lot of answers and lots of words, and we downsized the answers. And you can see here the question and what the responses were, and we got very, very interesting responses. So let's move another slide forward. And when we looked at the responses, we found out that actually these young people are relating to learning through 4 theories, or through 4 system of references. One is the constructivist approach. The other one is the experiential learning approach, which is somewhat overlapping with the first one, the LLL, or the lifelong learning approach, and the self-determination, or the SDT. And we found evidence of major aspects of all these 4 theories in the answer that these adolescents gave. Can you move forward, Oz? Another slide. So we are actually, we actually found here that if we think about the way these young people perceive learning, they perceive it through 4 major lenses, or major theories, or a major system of references. And we want to conclude and say that this is a very, very preliminary research. As you can see, we talked with 19 adolescents, but it is for us very, very interesting because it opens a door for further research. For example, we can look at the way parents and their children perceive learning through these 4 lenses and see similarities and differences and so on. So we chose to present a small scale research here, but for us it is at the beginning of looking into a new area that we didn't look before. And thank you for the opportunity to present our work and for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, we'll turn it over to Philippe. And Philippe, you're still muted.
Now it's okay. I think you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I'm just launching the presentation and it's okay. So thank you, everybody. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation draws on the investigations of a research team, which is funded by the French National Research Agency. Today, in this short presentation, I have three aims. First, I would like to deal with a question that was prevalent in the first sessions of the conference, namely the lack of comprehensive data about homeschooling families. Like many of you, we faced this obstacle, and I will tell you how we tried to overcome it. In my second part, I will show one example of what we can learn when we have access to reliable data sets. As you will see, this example is the case of the length of home education. And in the third part of the presentation, I will mention some other trends in home education in France. So now is my first point about data sets. So in the previous sessions of the conference, speakers emphasized their regret that we still lack very basic information about home education demographics. Such was our starting problem. In France, there is no open access public data about home education. The only information disclosed is the number of homeschooled kids in the country. This is a state figure where the definition of homeschooling is twofold. A homeschooled child is either a child that has been allowed to enroll remote public school or a child whose parents declared they would teach on their own. We know that there are at the moment about 60,000 homeschooled children aged 3 to 16. But are there more girls or boys? Do they live more in the country or in cities? How old are they? This is fully unknown, or sometimes this is known but carefully undisclosed. For our research, such information is absolutely necessary so we can design good case studies. So to answer this need, our team undertook to use state administrative data. We knew that home educators have two requirements. First, every home educator has to register. Every year, homeschooling parents must write to local administration to inform them in a written declaration. They write down the name, so implicitly the sex of the child, the place and the date of birth, their address. So we know that the administration has the relevant files to build demographics. The second requirement for homeschoolers in France is to be inspected. For those whose children are not enrolled in remote public school, every year the local administration organizes a meeting. After the meeting, inspectors write down a record, and this record is kept on the same shelves as the declaration. So parents must register and they must accept this oversight. So the administrative files are supposed to be exhaustive. They could lead to a well-informed picture of home education without the limits of convenience samples. Of course, this is not an unbiased source. This is surely not the best way to research how children learn at home. But we think it's the best way to know, for instance, if home-educated children are girls or boys, since the information is given on every declaration. So where are these precious files? In France, the state administration is divided into 100 geographical départements. And in every such department, there is one office that is responsible for collecting declaration and inspection files. Our research team contacted a dozen such offices. We offered to carry out independent and self-funded scientific research, of course, following all the rules concerning private and data protection. Among these dozen offices, we met with very, very different reactions. Though we in our team are all tenured public civil servants, it was sometimes tough to negotiate. Sometimes the answer was immediately and definitely no, and sometimes it was the opposite. I would like to insist on the fact that it takes time and it calls for diplomatic skills and other resources to gain access to such data. These difficulties are partly specific to home education. When we researchers conduct research about school, we do not face such challenges. In some departments, we had good luck, and I warmly thank their civil servants who were extraordinarily generous. So we spent many months negotiating access, and then we gathered data, and now we are analyzing data sets. I will just give one example now. This is my second point. Here I am commenting upon one single French department. This is one of the top 10 richest and most numerous departments. It is mainly urban, but not entirely. In this department, and nowhere else, we had the opportunity to design a big data set describing the nearly 5,000 registered homeschooled children during the last 17 years. These children were homeschooled under both systems, 1/3 with remote public schools and 2/3 without. Here is one question. How many years were they homeschooled? I cannot detail the methodological limitations of these results. We have done so in a 15 pages paper that I sent to Professor Cheng a few days ago. Sorry, Albert. And here I will just give one main result. More than half of children are homeschooled for 1 year or less, and 75% of children are homeschooled for 2 years or less. The duration is slightly longer for girls than for boys, but it's very marginal. Short-term home education dominates for all. This major fact is worth considering for the US too, since we can find in Eisenberg's studies or in the sample used by Daniel and Albert that short-lived homeschooling is widespread there too. So looking at just this simple fact brings out major implications. Very often it is asked whether homeschooled children are socialized or whether they developed academic skills. If we take into account that they are usually unschooled before and after home education and that the duration of home ed is very short, these questions are not so dramatic. Very often it is asked what the parents' motivations are. Our result raises the assumption that home education could massively be just a way to handle children's schooling and not an enduring choice for an alternative pedagogy. I'm going a bit faster. If we think that this is what I'll switch to the third point because I think I'm going to be short otherwise. So in the third point, I would like, since the title of the session announces trends in home education, I thought that some of you will be expecting to have a comprehensive presentation on home education in France. So I will give just some points. So in France, homeschooled kids are getting younger. As a consequence of the extension of mandatory education, 3 to 5 year old children have been counted since 2019, and they account for around 1/3 of the total. Therefore, this new way for the state to count should have the effect of extending home educational length. In France, home education is growing. As a consequence of the pandemic, home education has reached 0.5% of the school-age population. Since 1998, home education regulation in France has been reinforced. We are currently at the peak of this trend since the French government is considering a law according to which, starting in September 2022, families will no longer declare, but rather apply for an authorization to home educate. As you may imagine, home education associations are contesting this, and since October 2020, they have been actively opposing this government project to put home education under authorization. Another trend is the fact that home education regulation is professionalizing. State administration inspectors are getting longer training and new tools in order to better oversee families. Some facts are of major importance, though they are not a trend. Compared with the US, home education remains marginal, and probably it is here far less concerned with the religious motives. So, through these 3 points of my presentations, I developed the same main ideas. The idea is a plea for data because such data are not out of reach. In France, representative data are on the administration shelves, but they are not publicized. But in order to build knowledge, we need interest and support for accessing these data. Such support is, alas, far from easy to find. Of course, we are really excited to have fought for many months and to finally have succeeded in getting our data. But if this data had been simply disseminated in the first place, we would have spent more time analyzing and the results would have been more sophisticated. It's very uncomfortable for us researchers because we just want to produce knowledge about home education, but the context colors our results with potential political effects. Our own experiments is that facts are not very trendy. The national administration are not fond of disseminating knowledge about home education, but as academics, we consider building and sharing robust facts to be one of our missions, whatever the political use of such facts. Well, if you want to read more about home education in France, you will find in the slides some literature. That's the end of my presentation. I thank you all for your attention, and please forgive the way I read the paper.
Thank you very much. No apologies necessary. That was very, very clear. Thank you. Christine, you're up next. Christine, I'll just remind you, you're also muted.
Okay, you see my presentation, you hear me? Okay, so hello everybody. I'm talking from Quebec, a province in Canada. And today, just like Philippe did, I'm going to talk a little bit about my research and a little bit about the situation in Quebec, the home education situation. So I'll skip the presentation plan and get right into it. So in Quebec, well, you have to know that in Canada, there are 13 provinces and territories, and each one has its own regulations on home education and on education in general. So I'll focus on Quebec. Quebec is the one province that is French speaking completely, except for a minority English speaking. And home education has been legal here since 1943, and it's a right, so you don't have to apply for it or to ask for it. The regulatory framework has changed, has been completely revised in 2017 and 18, and I was hired as a consultant with the government to enhance or improve their knowledge about home education so that this framework would be somewhat more applicable, I hope. But I can tell you right away, they didn't listen to me all the way. It's a growing movement here too, as in many places. So just the recent numbers show that 4 years ago, there were 2,500 children, and last year it had doubled to, well, more, to almost 6,000 children, which is still just less than 1% of the school-age population. And the pandemic crisis obviously changed the data, but we don't know how it's going to stay like next year. I just would like to say that out of these 6,000 children home educated last year, let's say, more than 1,000 is communities of Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews that joined the movement recently, and others are either Christian or natural, as Ari said, or unschoolers, or all the rest of the home education planet. To situate our regulations, our new regulations, I know you can, maybe it's a bit small here, but I'm just showing this schema that I built with my doctoral student, Marine Dumont, to situate countries around the world and their regulations on home education. So there's two arrows, one that shows the parental decision-making power, and the other one is the state decision-making power. And we found out when looking at actual policies and practices in all countries, I think we reviewed 30 countries on all continents. Some measures were clearly giving more power to the state, others were clearly giving more powers to the parents, and others to none of them. And that's what's at the crossway, the third-party actors. In some countries, it's really the home education support groups that can regulate their own home education process and families. Private schools are given some powers to supervise home education, social services, and so on. So it was nicer for us to place it like that than just to say it's light regulation, heavy regulations, like this very one-way, one-dimensional categorization. So in Quebec, when we reviewed the law, the first draft of it was leaning on the left side. So support, and that's all the little red arrows, support approach and intervision approach. Intervision is the crossing of the parents' vision and some school authority or school counselor vision, and they cross together for the good of the child. And we had those and most of it is still there. So now families have access to school facilities such as libraries, science labs, art classes. They can access school exams if they request it. They can access the orientation counselors, have an ID card. So that's all in the support approach. In the intervision approach, there's an obligation to register, but up to 2 years ago, it was only a presentation by the parents of their chosen curriculum. And it was accepted as long as it touched the whole, the core competencies or the broad areas of learning. But as you see the little arrows falling down along the next frame, a new Ministry of Education recently changed the rule. And although the law is still there as a framework, and it should protect some kind of vision, this new minister decided that the parent program was not enough, and he imposed the prescribed national program as well as official provincial exams, standardized, you would say. But aside from that, as I said, the support is still there, and the intervision mentality is still there. So there's discussions between the parents and the school officials, let's say, or the monitors. And it's focused on the assessment of the child's progressing wherever they are, not attainment of a level. And the home education groups are recognized. Among other things, the law institutionalized consultation table that unites school authorities and homeschooling groups and homeschooling centers and researchers and education specialists. So this table of consultation gives some recognition that those actors are all valid people to be around the table to discuss the regulation of home education in Quebec. So as you see, in this intervision perspective, it means that there are people who are in charge of discussing with parents, who meeting with the parents, receiving their education plan, their program, their progress reports. And who are these people? With the pandemic, the Quebec province had to hire 100 of them. So they created a new bureau with those professionals who have to supervise and meet and accompany the families. So that's a new profession for us, home education monitor. And I know it's been happening for a long time. In France, they're called inspectors. In Switzerland, they're called education counselors, pedagogical counselors. And in many countries or states where there is some oversight, there are those professionals or whatever new roles called home education. I call them home education monitor. I don't know if it's the right word, but that's the word I'm going to use today. And I was very curious to find out what they really do, how they do it, because anybody who researches seriously governance of home education realizes that between what's in the law or on the website of the Ministry of Education and what's really happening on the field when the families meet those people, there's often a big gap. So I was curious about that. And here I'm not going to quote and cite everybody who's on this paper, but some researchers have already described how this job is hard to do because there's so many different perspectives and demands on those people from their authorities, from their employers, from the state, from the law, from the parents, and different kinds of parents. So it's not an easy job, but it seems that it has to be done in some states. So we might as well know what they're doing and maybe help them with some research to give them some training. So I did a literature review on the scarce research that has studied these monitors, what they do, how they do it. Few have done them, but it does exist up to now. And from the literature, I built a typology of their intervention strategies as described by the researchers. And then you'll see I'll finish on a questionnaire built on that typology that will help us study their practices. So very simple. I found 10 home education monitoring strategies that monitors use around the world as reported by researchers. And grosso modo, 5 of them seem preferable going in the orientation that the state gives them, and 5 of them seem counterproductive, but the monitors candidly admit doing them when they talk to researchers, maybe not to their boss, but to researchers they do. And I was one of them because I met with home education supervisors when it was our previous legal framework. There were fewer of them, but they were doing it a lot. And they told me how their job was difficult and how they had to be creative or avoiding to face this responsibility. So just briefly, how much time do I have left? Can anybody?
Yeah, I think we're bumping up against it now.
Okay, so you might have read it already. I'll just name them without description. And if anybody wants to have more description about one of them, they can ask me later. So an intercomprehension between the monitor and the parent of different perspectives, tolerance of disagreement on some aspects so that you can keep the collaboration going on, a focus on the child's interests, some kind of ingenuity because it's a different practice and you have to be creative sometimes, developing their own competence about doing this job and about home education. And the counterproductive strategies are neglecting their job, neglecting the children, trying to avoid it, some power abuse as an authority, the protection of their professionality if they feel on the defensive about who's the professional in education here against the parent, an incontestability of their judgment, and a basic strong distrust from the start towards every family would be counterproductive. So just quickly, the questionnaire, you see, takes every of the 10 strategies, elements of each, and asks questions. So in Quebec, we call them resource persons. So the parent can answer this questionnaire saying, my resource person makes the effort to understand my viewpoint. That would lead to the strategy intercomprehension. My resource person accepts some disagreements over certain issues. That would bring us to, and there's 50 of them, I think, 50 statements. And you can take the same questionnaire and turn it around for the resource person to answer by herself. So me as a resource person, I make the effort to understand parent viewpoint. I accept some disagreements.
Thank you, Christine. That's very interesting. And we will get back to some of these in the Q&A, but I think we need to move on to our discussant so that we have time for the question and answer. But thank you for your very interesting presentation.
My pleasure.
Albert, you're up.
All right. Thanks, guys. And thanks to all the panelists. Really fascinating work all across the board. I'm really enjoying engaging with that. And I'm glad to be here. I just have to pick on Paul for, always foisting the most challenging things on me all the time. Up to now, we've had webinars on just US homeschooling and on very specific topics. And then I'm supposed to talk about homeschooling in 3 different countries on a variety of different topics. So, Paul is some things never change here, but I'm glad to be here anyway. Anyway, I think, the title of the session here is Homeschooling and International Movement. And I think all of us have kind of suspected yes. And I think these three papers here certainly underscore the point. Also point folks who are interested in learning more about what's going on across the globe to several resources out there. I know Milton Gaither has recently edited a volume on homeschooling. The Wiley Handbook on Home Education, I believe is the title, and there's a whole section dedicated to homeschooling in a variety of countries in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand, all across Latin America, in the former Soviet bloc, and various places in Asia. And so we've only covered just a little, snippet of a lot of what's out there. So I want to point folks to that resource, and also to the Global Home Education Exchange, which is this network of homeschool researchers and practitioners across the country. And so for folks interested in learning a lot more, I want to encourage you to avail yourselves of those resources. I'll just make maybe one high level comment, just to leave enough room for Q&A. I'm always struck at how idiosyncratic the experience and history and practice of homeschooling is across the countries. And all of this always, I think, complicates the task of doing research, the task of policy making, the task of figuring out how to improve and manage homeschooling practices. Certainly as a social scientist myself and involved in just with a lot of policymakers, the practice of research and policymaking kind of inherently relies on precision of language, right? And definitions, procedures. We always want to have well-defined terms of what homeschooling is or is not. By nature, the policymaking and research likes to reduce things and break things down into rules and principles and component parts so that we can kind of manage and observe things formally and predictably. And yet I'm struck with all these papers from across the globe at the variegated nature of homeschooling and how this kind of pushes back against this tendency of social science and policymaking to try to wrangle things. And so this is a challenge I think I want to underscore. And this shows up in a lot of the papers that all the papers that we've covered today. For instance, in Ari and Oz's paper, what really fascinated me was the quotes that the students all used to describe their learning. The thought that came to me was, if John Dewey and all his early 20th century progressive friends had Twitter accounts, that's what they would tweet. All the quotes that the teenagers in Israel had mentioned. And so I'll point people to their paper. I mean, things like, I would learn just by looking at people and learning. It's human nature. You can't not learn. What do people learn? Why do people learn? To develop in every way. And all that just kind of harkens back to a lot of the thought that developed here in the progressive era here in the US. But despite that similarity, there's still vast differences in the US. I mean, the kind of progressive style homeschooling is just one of the many slices of homeschooling here in the US. I mean, we have folks here in the US homeschooling for cultural uplift reasons. We have people here in the US homeschooling for religious reasons, moral reasons, others for the simple pragmatic reason of an unsafe school environment. And so you can make the similar observation in France, as Philippe pointed out with his excellent work in gaining good data to study this. The duration of homeschooling varies across the board. Here in the US, here in France, and even in then, there's that diversity of homeschooling practice among families. And as Christina so clearly kind of articulated in her presentation, with her kind of two-dimensional schema of policymaking, right? There's a variety of dimensions and this wide spectrum of, do we prioritize state interests, parent interests? There's also the mention of the third party. I think all of this complicates our discussions and thinking about what's good homeschooling practice, policy, how do we do research? And I think really the moral of the story here is to approach all these things with a certain kind of intellectual humility in thinking about, well, what is best for a certain community might not generalize to other places. And perhaps I think that's a lesson that, researchers like myself, folks kind of tied to policy, and even practitioners who might be touting a certain curriculum or pedagogy in homeschooling would do well to recognize and approach this whole task of understanding homeschooling with humility and a posture of learning from one another, so that we might better serve our families, our children, and our communities better. And so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Albert. You make a great point about social scientists wanting to wrangle things, but we still need a better typology for homeschooling. So I just want to make that point. Paul, do you want to start with a question? We've got a number of really good questions here in the chat.
Well, why don't you begin, Daniel, and I'll pick up later.
Okay, so the first, I guess this is for all three. So here in the US, there's a lot of ideas. If you've not homeschooled or have no experience homeschooling, folks have a lot of notions about what homeschooling is. And a lot of the questions in the chat are about that. So how does the general public perceive homeschooling in your respective countries?
I think you're saying, are they accepted, or are they thought to be sort of strange people that need to be wondered about? So Philippe, you want to respond to that?
Yes, but the phone is ringing in my room. That's why. But I can try to do that. It will stop in a second. So yes, it's over. It's very difficult to say because the public space is really filled with biased representation. So what the general public thinks about home education is not clear. But we know that in the media there is a very, very wide presentation of home education, where home education is really positively presented, because the parent associations worked hard to show why they do that, they do it, to show how they home educate. And I think it's possible to sum it up like this. So you have a pretty positive presentation of home education in the media. And at the opposite, in the public government discourse, it's very negative, and they always put first the fact that there are religious radicalized parents who are willing to home educate, though they are not able to give facts about that. So the public discourses are really polarized, and what the French people really think is not that easy to tell, because it's so marginal. There are so few people that it's not that known. Sorry if it's not clear.
Well, in Israel, you have to remember that I think 6 or 7 years ago, not many people knew about homeschooling at all. So they didn't think anything positive or negative about homeschooling. Usually they used to ask, is it possible? Actually, Ari and I tried to make homeschooling more known to the public. We give a lot of interviews to newspapers and news broadcasts and other media. When people learn about homeschooling, the first thing they usually ask is, are they socialized? And do they have social skills and other questions? It's the questions that usually people ask. But I think if you look at the last 2 or 3 years, the view of homeschooling is getting way better. And some educational specialists in Israel, which are well known in the public, are even looking at homeschooling as I don't know, education for people who can afford homeschooling or something like that. So the view of homeschooling is becoming better, I think, by the day.
Well, I actually enjoy sharing a fact that Horace Mann, the great founder of the public school in the United States, homeschooled his own children. Christine, how about in Quebec?
Here, when they changed the law, a lot of people heard about home education for the first time. Yeah, so just like us says, a lot of people just don't know about it. Then that just leads way to prejudices, preconceptions. But maybe I could answer by saying that it's the Liberal Party who changed the law and made it more open and more equitable. And then it's a more conservative party who, political party who made it more strict with an imposed program and imposed exam. So that's surprising usually. I think we would see the opposite in the United States. And each of these parties have their political base who support them. So I would tend to think that there's a group in Canada and in Quebec who think that it's an option that should be available for different either cultural reasons or pedagogical reasons or whatever. And there's a group who thinks that you have to follow a good program to get a good diploma, to have, to become a good worker and make the province richer or whatever, So there are those two tendencies. Maybe I'd like to add the hint, and I'm sure a lot of you will share this idea, that the crisis, the pandemic crisis, made a lot of people try home education, either because they had it in mind and they said, let's try it now, or it was their only viable option at that moment. And I've observed, it's not a clear research that I've done, but I've read and observed that some people came out of it saying, never again, I don't know how people do it, and either I admire them or we should make it stricter because anything goes. So those people have a negative view on home education now, and others who tried it said, wow, that I'm going to keep going towards it because it benefited my family or my children. So I think this pandemic probably really changed the previews, the preconceptions that people had, for the best or the worst.
Well, thank you, Albert. Around the world, by the way, Albert, please share the resources on the chat function. But for now, would you just sort of say, how do you think the view of homeschooling is in general across nations, as best you can tell from having explored the literature?
Yeah, I mean, I would hardly consider myself the expert to go on this, but certainly in some countries, homeschooling still is illegal. Right? There is certain, the promulgation of some of the, I guess, the more negative stereotypes we've kind of heard. But in other countries, there are these communities and pockets of folks in a variety of countries. I mean, thinking of folks I know in the Philippines or in Taiwan, Latin America, just smaller communities that are getting a political say in public, government institutions to lobby and push for the right to homeschool. And so perhaps the indication that there is this debate out there probably speaks to, in my estimation, again, just how polarizing in some sense the issue is. So you'll have folks that love it and will advocate for it wildly, and those who are vehemently opposed, and everyone in between.
Well, thank you. So I'm going to ask another question that's in the chat function that people have brought up, and that is, we learned that in Israel, if you talk to the students directly, they have a very experiential, constructivist notion of what it is to homeschool and how to learn, which really runs counter to sort of the traditional ideas about what homeschooling is, maybe drill and kill, and you fill out the answers and you memorize your letters and your numbers, and it's really very boring. So let me ask what some of the other panelists feel about the story that they got back from talking with adolescents in Israel. Philippe, do you want to comment on that? Do you have any sense of how students feel about the homeschooling experience?
I'm sorry not to have a very good data on that topic. So no, I don't have any objective data on the topic. I'm sorry.
Okay, any feel for it? Do you talk to homeschoolers? You have any?
Yes, but the homeschoolers we meet are really often families who are really highly involved in family education, and they are so in France, you know, informal learning and unschooling way of living are widely spread in the home education community, and there it's always stressed that if the children want to go back to school, if it's their choice, they can do it. So the teenagers we meet always, very often in such families, families where the children and teenagers are really okay and they appreciate and they like to be home educated. So but we know that these families are not representative of the 60,000 home educated children that we can see in the administrative data. So the few very involved families give the picture of very happy families, and that's great. But if we define home education as the administrative status to be not at school, the picture is very different. That's our point.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. Christine, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Well,
I know it's not easy to get information about this.
yeah, it's unfortunately very rare that researchers find some methodology to really ask the children, and it's easier with teenagers than with actual younger children. I recently sent to the Journal of Pedagogy a thematic issue that will come out soon, the data from one of my doctoral students' work on schooling, and he interviewed with a phenomenological approach, in-depth interviews with 5 young adults who had been unschooled, and they tell about their experience. And the 5 experiences are very different. I say 3 of them are rather positive and 2 are very negative in their own perception. And they seem like the typical images that we get from unschooling. So I'll let you read them. But for example, there's the very religiously closed off, neglected child who had to learn everything by herself because their parents were caring for her, and she thrived. She finally got to a post-secondary school through her own efforts. There's the one who was in a very ideological, very open-minded family where unschooling was seen like the ideal and school was seen as like the prison. And she was told that so often and implicitly that she integrated it. But in the end, she says, unschooling was the prison because I became afraid of the institutions and afraid of evaluation. And I could never do the career I wanted to do because I didn't learn it in a regular school. And then there are the 3 of them, you know, the IT specialist who learned everything about programming by himself and became a good programmer without any diploma, and the 2 other experiences where they are going in and off in school, out of school, and thriving, you know, having a good time.
Well, thank you, Christine. Let me ask one last question. I got to tell this anecdote. You know, the unschooled person who became the most influential person in the world that I know of is Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar. He was totally unschooled. He spent all of his time learning how to build navies and armies and fortifications, and he was very successful in life pursuing that occupation. So Oz and Ari, should we, are the students the ones who make the decision, or are the parents? You said the parents made the decision. Some people in the chat function said, no, the students are making the decisions. So do you want to comment on that?
Yes, but first I want to say that we know very little about what young adolescents, homeschooled adolescents think. So we actually talked to 19 children, and we have like the beginning of a sense of what is going on there. But still, this is an area that we don't know much about. Still, when we think about all the research we've done with parents, in Israel, many parents actually choose to homeschool because they are discontent with the public education system. They claim that the public education system failed to help their children be prepared for the current situation, for the 21st century. So they actually say we have no other choice but to educate them ourselves. So the decision is usually by the parents. However, once the parents are into constructivist learning approach, and one of the pillars of this approach is to let the learner be engaged, then they also let the children decide what to learn and when to learn and how to learn and so on and so on. So we have all kinds of varieties, but this is, I think, the link between these two things. Yeah.
Well, we certainly have learned that there are varieties of homeschooling, that there is no simple category out there. And thank you all for participating in this session today. It's been informative and instructive. And we will have our final session of our conference on schooling in the post-pandemic era this coming week. So Daniel, do you just want to mention what's next?
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you to the panelists. A very fascinating look at 3 countries. So next week, yes, we will be reconvening at the same time, of course, same place, and we have 5 parents who homeschool. And so we're doing something a little bit different in this final session, maybe something academics don't do enough of, is to talk to the actual people who are homeschooling. And we have parents who really cover a very wide range of different types of homeschooling and different rationales for homeschooling. So that's what we'll be doing next week. And we look forward to catching up with everyone then.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all.
A real pleasure.
Merci beaucoup.